over on Patreon, we've been doing like a teeny tiny study on the book of Second Corinthians. So I believe the Bible is done best in community. It is not a solo sport. It is my favorite thing to do. So as we've been doing that on Patreon, something caught my attention. It was actually my friend Dana on Patreon narrowed in on Second Corinthians chapter 1, verses like 4 through 7. Now, I had been reading Second Corinthians, the book of Second Corinthians, over and over and over for the last 2 months. These 3 or 4 verses did not stick out to me until I heard Dana talk about it. Like talk about what was sticking out to her. Then all of a sudden, it's just like my eyes were like, whoa, I had not seen it that way before. This idea of sharing in our sufferings. Well, that sounds terrible. I don't think it's terrible. I think it's fantastic. Maybe you'll end up thinking it's fantastic too. Who in the world likes to suffer? Absolutely no one. Who in the world suffers? Absolutely everyone. It is a universal feeling. Now, let's take off the docket those of us who maybe have had an easier life than those around you, or maybe you think about people across the world that have it a whole lot harder than you do or I do. We're not going to talk about suffering in terms of comparing it to other people. If you are human, you have suffered. Maybe you've suffered less than other people, but you have suffered. I have personally been walking through this journey of asking God to heal the damage that has been done to me through sexual abuse in my childhood. It's been a little over 4 years, and it has been so hard. The suffering that I have like squelched down has risen to the surface in ways that feel so uncomfortable. But that's my goal. I want to feel. I want to actually be able to cry, because for many years, I literally could not cry. I felt, it's not that I didn't feel, but my feelings I knew were not the same as other people's feelings. And I definitely knew I could not express my feelings in a way that was vulnerable to other people, not even really to myself. Like, I'm embarrassed to cry in front of my own self. That's the situation. I'm getting better. So as I've been working on this, I don't know, a couple months ago, I was very upset. Let's call it suffering, because suffering is anything that feels like a weight being pressed on us. Literally, when we go to look at this word, the Latin would translate this word suffering that's in 1 Corinthians as a pressing. Back in New Testament, 2,000 years ago, some criminals died by pressing. And that word pressing was called suffering. Like with a large rock would be placed on them and they would be pressed to death. And I think that's a really good analogy or a way to think about suffering. If you've ever woken up with something sitting on your chest, that's a pressing, that's suffering. So anyway, I was suffering. I was sitting in our room alone. My husband was in the other room, and I was so upset. I mean, I really could feel my feelings, and I'm crying, like with real tears coming down my cheeks. I got up and I thought, I want to share this with Jared. I mean, I wanted to and I didn't want to. Do you know what I mean? It felt so vulnerable to share this pressing feeling and what all was involved with that with him. So I remember so clearly just standing where he couldn't see me yet. I was kind of standing in the shadows of the hallway at the entrance of his office where he was at. He was sitting at his desk, just standing there, making the decision. Am I going to share this with him? Am I going to invite him into this? Am I going to put out my hands and say, here is my suffering? Or am I going to turn around and walk back into the other room? I really didn't know. I sat there, I don't know, for 3 minutes. It wasn't quick, making the decision of what I was going to do. I took a deep breath and I ended up walking into his office, and he looks up and he sees my face and he's like, oh no, what's wrong? And he has this little chair like with his feet, and he just scoots up to me, like wheeling up to me with his chair. and I sit down on the couch that's in his office. And as I laid out my suffering to him, the weight, the feelings that were pressing on me, there was an exchange that happened. And that's the exchange that I want to talk about, because I think that is what 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 4 through 7 are talking about. Sharing in our suffering leads to sharing in God's comfort. I'll finish up the story with Jared in a bit, but let's get to the actual verse. I'm going to read this out of the NIV, and it actually starts with verse 3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And here it is, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. Verse 4, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. We're not going to land much on that. I'm just giving you context to where we are in this conversation. Let's look a little bit deeper into verse 5. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, that sounds wonderful, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. The reason this word share stuck out to me when Dana brought this up, because anytime I had read this in the last 2 months, which was quite a few times, I think I just thought about sharing like, hey, can we sit down for coffee? I need to share with you. Like, I need to tell you something. I need to give you the details. I need to share with you what's on my heart. Like, that's the kind of share that I was thinking about. But as I looked at this, I was like, for the first time, thinking, I don't think that's exactly what that means. So when I went back to the original languages, which, by the way, I don't know Greek, I don't know ancient Hebrew. I'm looking at this carefully, knowing there's a lot of things I don't understand about the original languages. But one thing I did notice in Strong's Concordance was that there was no word for share. I mean, are they just like making this word up? I don't think so. What it looked like is they took the word, the spirit of the word R, O-U-R, and turned that into share. Because if you think about it, what the actual word share means is it means it's no longer my suffering, it's our suffering. Doesn't that sound delightful? It's not just telling someone that you're suffering, it's actually sharing it, giving them a piece of your suffering. So I tried my best to think about some visual, and I could not come up with it, and I didn't have time to like run it by friends enough to get something. So this is all I got, and it's not good. But we've got this suffering. Now, I want you to think that this is a suffering of any kind. Remember, oppressing, that we all have had at one time in our life. It presses on us. It makes us suffer. It keeps us up at night. I don't have to tell you what yours are. You know what yours are. I know what mine are. I think what I thought about when I read this verse was like pointing to it to somebody and verbally telling them, here's my suffering. And let's just pretend there's like pictures on here that I would describe my daughter, who at the age of 2 passed away. And I would describe her, and I would describe what that suffering felt like and feels like to me. But I don't think that's what this is. My suffering becomes your suffering when I take my suffering, at least a piece of it, and I give it to you. I share it with you. Now, there's something that has to happen. If my hand is extending out to you with this suffering that I have, let's just take Jared in this instance. He had a decision to make. He could either look at this suffering and say, no, thank you, not feeling it right now. Then I'm left to take it back. Boy, is that a terrible feeling. Or that person, Jared, or whoever it is on the other end, decides to receive that suffering. Because if we're sharing, 2 things have to happen. Somebody has to give, and then the other person has to receive it, to receive the suffering, so that there is now, let's pretend the person's over here, there's now joint ownership in this suffering. Joint ownership. Now, maybe you're thinking, but Melissa, wait, the original context, Paul is probably saying it's persecution. Well, that was Paul's suffering, but that was not the suffering that was happening at the church at Corinth. Actually, quite the opposite. Priscilla and Aquila, I can't remember if it was Rome or Ephesus. I should have looked, but I didn't. But Priscilla and Aquila, which you guys know them from the New Testament, evangelists, teachers, leaders within the church, a mighty power couple they were. And they had fled because of persecution to the city of Corinth. So at least at this time, as far as I can see, there was no persecution happening. That's not, I don't think, what Paul was referring to. He was referring to this collective human experience, I believe, of suffering. Just as Christ suffered, we will suffer as well. Christ gives us an example of how to suffer, and we now share with other believers. If we do this giving and receiving of suffering, my suffering becomes our suffering, and your suffering becomes our suffering when we do this giving and receiving. Now, verse 7 comes in to give us some good news, because it's like, well, now we're just all carrying around suffering and we're all weighed down by each other's sorrows and woes. No. I don't believe that's true, because it doesn't just stop there with the suffering. It says this, and our hope, this is what Paul is saying. I have hope. I have expectant, eager faith for you, and it's firm. And here's the reason that hope Paul has for the Corinthians is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so Paul is saying, just as I'm suffering for the gospel, and that is in persecution, I'm sharing that with you and you're receiving it, which means now this suffering is our suffering. Just as much as that is true, we also share in God's comfort. So as this exchange happens with suffering, there's also an exchange happening with God's comfort. Let's see if I can do this right. So here I am suffering, and I share that suffering with Jared. Now that is a vulnerable thing to do. Now what he decided to do, which he hasn't always done, and I haven't always done for him, but in this instance, what he decided to do was to take on that suffering, to bear that burden with me, to listen, to be with me, to be present with me. So my suffering became our suffering. Now, it didn't stop there, because then what Jared did was he took the comfort that he has received over his life from God. God has given it. Jared has received it. He then took that comfort and extended it to me. Now, I have the same choice. He's now taken on my suffering, and he's extended this comfort of God in a real practical, hands-on way. I mean, with real presence of mind and body and hugging and listening. And it was very tangible comfort. Now, I had a choice then. Do I rebuff this comfort and say, no, you really don't care, or I don't deserve it, or whatever it is? I could do that. I could give it back to him, or I could receive that comfort. I have actually been very bad at receiving comfort from people. So maybe somebody will understand this, but I've given away my suffering, and so there is a shouldering. I can somewhat do that better than I can receive the comfort. And that's what I'm learning in this season of life, is to actually receive God's comfort from other people. I don't know why it's so hard, but it feels hard. But as I did that 2 months ago or whatever it was with Jared in his office while I'm sitting on the couch and he scooted up his chair next to me, it was so impactful. I feel like because it was a comfort from God, it did something on the inside of me that changed me. It has made me, I've been worrying about something, like a particular area, and I'm realizing that I'm carrying this load on my own. That exchange of me giving him my suffering and him giving me God's comfort, it makes me trust him more. And so I'm realizing that I'm not vocalizing this worry that I have with him. And because of that exchange that happened, I have been much more ready to share with him this suffering, this pressing of weight, this worry, and be like, wait a second. No, he's there with me. We get to do this as a team. And it's been really insightful and really helpful. Now, all I have left is a bunch of scrap paper. I'm not saying this is all sunshine and roses. This idea of sharing in our suffering and receiving God's comfort back, because there's got to be two humans involved. And when there's two humans involved, there's two very broken people that it can go really wacky and sideways. I've messed up in this area. I've had other people mess up in this area toward me where I've been hurt. I've hurt other people. So I don't want to just say, oh, this is just so easy. Take your most vulnerable thing and then just go out and share it with somebody, just hoping they're going to receive it. And when they don't feel crushed, just do it again. No, this is very hard things to practice. It's very hard. But as I read the book of 2 Corinthians, what I can't get over is that as Paul is saying this, the church at Corinth has totally crushed him. He is hurt. His feelings are hurt. He basically says so. Like he's crying, he's distressed, he's not coming back to visit them because he doesn't want to pain them any more than he's already pained them. They're talking about him. They're saying he's not a real apostle. His feelings are so hurt. And the church at Corinth has not done this well. They have not done this relationship with Paul well. So Bible Lab is also studying it, which is why we're doing it on Patreon. And Bible Lab is a group that I'm trying to develop for group learning. And so as Bible Lab is more ahead of Patreon. So as Bible Lab has had these conversations, we're astonished that Paul has stuck in, that as a leader, he's been so vulnerable. And he still says these things as truth, even though the Corinthians have really botched it up. And I'm sure Paul has botched it up too. I can't tell you what to do, and I don't want to tell you what to do. The nuances of your life are nothing that I can see into or peer into. It would be dangerous and foolish of me to try to do so. But I'll tell you what I have experienced and what I will keep leaning into, and you take what's useful and scrap the rest. I am looking for really tiny ways to do this, giving and receiving, both. I want to receive suffering of others, and I want to give mine to others. And I also want to give God's comfort and receive God's comfort in really small ways. I'm trying to practice this muscle with people I really trust, with people I've been in relationship with for a very long time. I'm trying to be open and aware of this mutual exchange. I mean, I think that would be my bottom line for now, is being open to both give and to receive, both to give and receive this mutual sharing of suffering, and also to give and receive this mutual gift of God's comfort. I'm doing it, or at least trying to do it, on purpose in very, very small steps. And I'm trying to articulate it to my people that I'm actually doing it. I'm going to be sharing, so I'm asking you to listen to me. But I'm asking not with a pointed finger like I just had, but like with a soft heart, like seriously, with a soft heart, to be like, will you listen to me? I'm learning how to, specifically to Jared, to ask for what I need. It is very difficult for me. So I'm practicing this. So will you listen? Yeah, sure. Thanks for doing that. Like I needed you to do that. The same thing with Jared. I'm trying to slow myself down and to really articulate what I'm trying to do, or what I'm trying to give, or what I'm trying to receive. I'm trying to slow down and articulate that, and the reason why I'm doing that. That has been helpful for me, at least in this season. It is risky. This mutual sharing of suffering and this mutual sharing of God's comfort, it is very risky. But the payoffs, like a lot of risky things, are massive, are huge. They've changed my life. And I have a feeling and a hope that they will continue to change my life even more as I grow closer and more vulnerable to those around me. Okay, I need to stop blabbering on and let you go. If you're interested in Patreon, it could be as little as $1 a month. You choose how much you pay. I would love to have you over in that community over there. It's a lot of fun. We do lightweight Bible study. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about my journey of discovering how to feel again, you can find it here in this video. Either way, I hope to see you next week.